Okay, I make that a couple of minutes past, and I suspect we'll still have a few more people joining us, but shall we make a start? Hello to everyone who's with us at this webinar. Hello, good morning if you're joining us from North America. Good afternoon if you're joining us from Europe. Good evening if you're joining us from Asia, and if you're joining us from Australia or the Pacific, we can only apologize, but thank you for making the effort. Welcome to the second in our series of webinars on the education research policy relationship in global perspective. The series is sponsored by GLACIER, and GLACIER is the Glasgow Comparative and International Education Research Network here at the School of Education at the University of Glasgow. I'm Michelle Schweisforth. I'm your host for this afternoon. I'm a professor of comparative and international education here at the school and a member of GLACIER. And it is my huge pleasure today to welcome Professor Gita Steiner-Khamsi of Teachers College, Columbia University. And she's going to be talking to us this afternoon or morning or evening or middle of the night on understanding school reforms in their context. And Gita is the William H. Kilpatrick Professor of Comparative Education at Teachers College at Columbia. She's also an honorary UNESCO co-chair of Comparative Education Policy at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And she has published widely on policy borrowing, global governance, and comparative education policy. And she is a truly esteemed expert on all of those topics. So we're absolutely delighted to have her here with us this afternoon. Gita's going to talk for about 20 or 30 minutes. She has some slides prepared. We will then have a respondent. My colleague Tor Sorensen will spend a few minutes responding to Gita's talk and asking a couple of preliminary questions. Then there will be around half an hour for colleagues who are on the webinar to pose questions. We have different ways you can do that. At the moment, for participants who are not hosts, your cameras and microphones are off and muted, but we will try to turn those on for the discussion so that you can pose your questions verbally if you like. But there is also a chat function and a Q&A function, so multiple ways to pose your question. And if I lose control of one of those lines, I'm hoping that my GLACIER colleagues, Matthew, Simon, Ian, will be able to help. So once again, thank you very much, Gita. A very warm welcome, and over to you.
So thank you so much, Michelle, Matt, Simon, Tor, and all your wonderful people at Glasgow. I really love what happened to that International Comparative Education Program. And I think our field is getting stronger and stronger, among others because of the kind of work that you're doing at Glasgow. So it's a real honor to be here. And I'm also very happy about the name of your network because I am Swiss, in case you don't know. Originally, I'm Swiss, and now you see on the title slide, you see the Glacier in Switzerland, and it's just a perfect choice of name to talk about international and comparative ed. So let me tell you what I plan to do. This is an overview of what I will be talking today about it. And unsurprisingly, I will talk about traveling reforms or policy borrowing or policy mobilities. There are different names, also sometimes diffusion of innovation. So I will tell you first what this is all about, the phenomenon itself. And together with others in this room, I consider myself to be a qualitative comparativist or doing contextual comparison. And that means there are usually two things for sure that we in qualitative comparison consider context. One is space or topographical issues. And actually, Michelle Schweisforth, recently, I love the work you did on Macy, and you wrote about, there's really interest now. It's relatively new, I find, to talk about space versus place, to talk about reference societies, which is an old topic of Shriver, but also of David Phillips. And then my own thing is about the temporal dimension, looking more, and I'm talking today about research that I did for my forthcoming book, which looks at the temporal dimension of policy transfer. And I look at, as always, in the context of systems or systems theoretical. And the third point, and that's the main thing, after having set the stage, I will then show you how school reform, once you look at the temporal dimension and you look at the context of school reform as a part of a bigger public administration reform, how this will make sense, or different kind of sense than what we are used to. And finally, I use the example of SAWA, which is a term that Tony Verger from Barcelona and his colleagues, they coined that term, but the term comes actually from OECD and the World Bank. But what they did is they put the little word with in it. So it's not just school autonomy and accountability, but school autonomy with accountability. And I will tell you why this little word is so important. So let's start talking about what is the phenomenon. In research, we always set out the research question that is related to a phenomenon that we are trying to understand. That's the phenomenon. The phenomenon, and it's called the lazy S curve because it looks like an S that is in a sleeping position. The phenomenon is some innovation, and innovation, don't get me wrong, can be good or bad, or some idea, or some reform, or rumors, or fashion, or any of this. It starts small and it gets big. And for good reason, this has also been called the epidemiological model. And unfortunately, because of COVID, we all know what this means. We know that it starts slow, and at some point, that's where the first circle is, it becomes a pandemic. That means it spreads explosively. There's exponential growth, explosive growth. And then at some point, there is a point of saturation or burnout. And the only reason why there is a point of saturation is because there is like a herd immunity. Remember, that's how it was called in COVID, only because 80 or 90% of people got affected. In the case of school reform, a point of saturation is reached when many, many countries, maybe with the exception of North Korea and Iran and some other countries, have adopted that reform. So this is a global reform. And of course, it only becomes global once in the middle stage, when more and more join. And the more countries join, the easier it is for a country to adopt a reform that goes global, because by that time it is everybody's and nobody's reform. It's depoliticized, it's decontextualized, it comes across as a best practice, it comes across as an international standard. So we have a zillion of interesting questions, I think, that we have when we look at this kind of lazy S curve. One of it is how important is who the early adopters are, like the slow growth rate. Does it matter that does it have to be an OECD country, or does ever a reform except Freire's thinking start in the global south and then spread? So there's a zillion of interesting questions, but I just want you to keep that in mind, that this kind of phenomenon is what we are interested in to explain in global diffusion of innovation, policy transfer, policy mobility. I like to call it policy borrowing, and I will tell you why. It's because I put agency. So for me, it's not just the passive diffusion that spreads like COVID, but it's an active reception. And I will explain to you why the agency part is important to me. So this is the school reform that has been described by many because it has spread globally. And it's actually a good moment to look back because it is done. It has the reach of saturation. It's school autonomy with accountability. And it started somehow in Australia, New Zealand, And then from there, somehow it came to the UK, to the US, and then you see the airplanes going back and forth. So this was the transatlantic busy traffic. So Blair would refer, Thatcher would refer to Reagan, and Reagan would refer to Thatcher to mutually legitimize the reform. So it was with every step. So these are the early adopters, and it had different names because they were locally adapted. So started out with OBE, outcomes-based education, but then it became an issue of national curriculum and school choice. In the US, it added more component also of school-based management. So with every travel, a local variant was added to the reform. And this is the study that I find really interesting. And the whole last year, it became also the inspiration for my next book. This is the study that the Stanford group has been working on together with Toronto, and specifically Patricia Bromley and in Stanford and Ria Kojima at Toronto. So what they did, and this is a huge gift to the International Comparative Society and GLACIER, they collected at the global level any single reform or policy document that exists or that is available, and they put it in a database. What they ended up with is they have reforms from all the 193 countries, over 10,000 documents, and they go further back and back in time. So, but they started with 1970 to 2020, and here you have, even 1960, but they're going now even further back. And what they did is they then categorized it by thematic priorities. So they coded it basically, and they found several things. One thing, they found a reform bubble or reform frequency or reform intensity over the period. Let me just make sure I read it correctly. Over the period 1991, do you see? And 2007. This is where there were many, many reforms. You see it goes up the curve, and the number of reforms per year goes up, as well as the average number of reforms per country. You see there's this reform bubble. And before, there was always reform, and reform is measured in terms of policy documents or, laws or amendments to laws, decrees that were issued in that year. So you see there was a lot going on. And this actually corresponds to our sentiment that this was a reform era. And they call it the neoliberal reform era. So before that, they call it the liberal era, and then afterwards the post-liberal era. So the neoliberal era, which is this reform package, school autonomy with accountability, that was the height of that reform between 1991 and 2008. So after the last economic crisis, or second to last economic crisis, there was an abrupt end of reform activity. But this is the neoliberal era. So in order to look at global trends, and I call that this a macro level analysis, they are not really interested in individual countries because they are quantitative researchers. So we complement each other, people in qualitative comparative ed, because we are interested not on the aggregate when you count all the countries together, which is what macro sociologists or neo-institutionalists in this case would do, but we are interested in the individual country. Why, at what moment in their local context do they adopt a country, and how do they adopt it? Because every borrowed policy is selectively adopted and also translated differently. So this is a macro level analysis of global trends, school trends over time. And sure enough, when they look at thematic priorities, and this is one of their now postdocs, Lisa Overbay, they say, and again, this is something that intuitively we know, but they can show it with their wonderful data, that the number of reforms that explicitly mention and relate to quality goes up exponentially between 1970 and 2010. Do you see this? The quality one is the one with the circle. And then the one with access was very big in the 1970s. That was when educational expansion occurred worldwide. In all the post-colonial countries was an explosive growth of education, but also in OECD countries, there was a growth in terms of from primary to lower secondary to upper secondary to vocational to higher ed. So we have two types of expansion in education. We have one that goes by level of education to the point of so-called over-education. That's the term they use in China. But we also have expansion in terms of more and more people admitted to education and enrolled, starting with girls and women, but also with minority groups, students with special needs, disenfranchised groups, etc. So this phenomenon that quality is considered important, and this is why I think a sequential time is important. And I want to talk about three aspects of time today to you. One is sequence, and one is timing of policy borrowing, and one is duration once it's adopted. How long does it last? So another way of looking at this figure is to look at it temporally. Did I say that correct, Michelle? No. In temporal times. You can say that access was first and quality was second. And maybe it's connected. And maybe it is connected that when educational system, and that's a system theoretical way of looking at things, once system adopt and open and enroll a big number of students into the system, it becomes both equality but also equity issues, because some districts, some provinces are not able to hold up with the big demand for education. We know from Kenya and Tanzania that at one time when they stopped charging tuition, thank God, for primary school, enrollment rate soared, and they had like teacher-student rate, they have classroom sizes of 90 students per classroom. And then you have equality issues, because once you ensure access, quality maybe follows. So I tried to look at that at different countries to see whether that really applies, this sequence, and how this is translated also in public administration reform. Again, as I said, it is a good idea to look back at school reform with a distance, with a time lag, because then you can see how it grew over time. So for me, the left side was first, school autonomy, and the right side came later, accountability. And that's really important, because we now talk always about, and combined the idea, and we can say in retrospect, it was a myth, or it was, the idea is that if you give school autonomy, then, and hold schools accountable as measured in the performance of students, then the quality of schools improve. And why? Because the left package had school choice, and this is like a aggregate model. So it is like if you put everything together, of course, every country selectively borrows some policies from that package and leaves others aside. So the left side had school choice, incentives for non-state actors like private actors to come in and open schools. It had per capita financing, school boards, school development plans and profiles. it had professionalization of school management. In many countries, there were no professional school directors before that reform. Only when decentralization came and school-based management, the habit was stopped of having senior teachers do also administrative tasks. So it went along with a whole package of reforms. And when you look at it from a distance, it makes sense. It all comes together. And I just had a brilliant student, Thomas Esper, who worked with Tony Berger in Barcelona, and he's a TC grad, finished his dissertation on this mechanism. So it was all about giving autonomy to schools, at the same time encourage the private sector to come in, create competition between schools, because once you have per capita financing, the school gets money based on number of enrollments, and schools would be interested to have more money because they have the autonomy to spend it how they want, so they can give bonuses to teachers if they want. And this in turn will attract good teachers will attract good students, etc., etc., etc. And that will then create somehow a quality improvement. So this was, of course, neoliberal thinking par excellence, because it was demand supply driven. The idea was the market knows better. And then you had characters like Milton Friedman in the US, who calculated, and that's Martin Carnoy's great contribution referencing that. He calculated based on the programs in California that if you let the market rather than the state regulate the education system and create this kind of pressure on schools, the per cost of student would be half because they would not waste it, they would compete with each other. And of course, this is music in the ear of ministers of finance at the time where educational expansion was rampant, was huge. And the welfare state could not keep up with all the big state apparatus and all the expenses they had in health, in education, in all the sectors. So once this happened, and I will go more systematically into it afterwards, once this happened, it became really a quality issue, because it was rampant in some countries, especially in the UK, Great Britain, the entry of private actors, privatization, school choice, it was completely deregulated in some countries more than others. Never in the Nordic countries, never in some countries of Western Europe, but in some countries, in the early adopter countries, it went completely out of the deregulation really was a disaster. So the right side came afterwards, and what we see today with PISA and more tests, etc., was actually a response to this deregulation. So the right side was a re-regulation or re-centralization by having a national curriculum. And so the role of the state changed from a state that controlled during the welfare state to then didn't do much during the school autonomy phase and deregulated, delegated to the market, and then to one that had standardized curriculum as a precondition to have standardized tests, etc., and all these other things that follow. So what we have today came later, but together, of course, this is a neoliberal reform package, if you look at it in combination. And of course, and we can talk about that in the discussion, the role of the OECD and the World Bank is not to be underestimated, because OECD had in 2003 the SECO report, and actually, which is definition and selection of key competencies. And actually, the Swiss were very strong there. Again, GLACIER comes to mind. And my boss, Uri Trier, because I worked for 10 years in the Ministry of Education of Zurich, he was the leading force in having cross-curricular competencies rather than the IEA type of test where you test expected, curriculum with achieved and implemented. So the model of OECD of testing skills rather than knowledge then went global. But we can talk about that. And the Swiss, again, had a really important role in that, in particular, my boss at that time, Uri Peter. So let's keep going and show you. So remember I told you that the Stanford and the Toronto group, they looked at the macro level. The meso level, this is what I do, and a lot of other qualitative comparativists, and it is the old, that's Michelle's original, if I may say, you can correct me. That is her original field of research. We are both education transfer researcher with her work at Oxford with David Phillips, but also in Schriever in Berlin. And I did that a little bit younger than the colleagues. I did that in New York. So we look usually at small n, we look at case studies, we look at contextual comparison, we focus on the local, the national, and because of that, we look at reception, why and when did something resonate, when was a buy-in at the local level, and then how was it translated. And the new thing that I did not do before, I only do that for 2-3, actually I do it to be precise, the first time with my former doctoral student, Iveta Silova. That was the first time we looked at the reform as a package. And this was, I believe, in 2009, when we assembled colleagues from the former Soviet Union. It's the book, How NGOs React. And the research question there was, and Soros Foundation was funding that project. The question was, you all have the same point of departure. You are all post-Soviet states. 15 years later, which trajectory was taken from that reform package that was transferred or imposed on you, such as extension from 10 years to 12 years, replacing Russian with English, demoting technical vocational education, and. So we try to define the features of the reform package that they were confronted with, and we looked exactly at the meso level, at reception, at translation, or in other words, we looked at pathways or trajectories, being almost like a historical institutionalist lens, given that they all had the same historical antecedents. So Palin, Pearson, Abbott, all the ones that do sequential analysis would have loved it, because we really did look at historical antecedents that shape the way new reforms or global reforms are adopted. The right side, I did not do, and there are colleagues who start to do that. I only mention it. I think it's interesting, but I don't have time. I run out of time to do that. The macro level analysis would be to look at people that move or actors that move. And I know Stephen Ball looked at, the interconnection between the private sector and state actors. He did, I forgot, network ethnography, or I forgot the name that he used. But, another good example is Sir Michael Barber, who was in academia. He was at Pearson. He now is a university, I think, chancellor in Great Britain. So he bridged the private sector, academia, government. He was remember he was into, and I cannot, with my Germanic background, I cannot pronounce that name. He did deliver law. Michelle, help me out. What was that thing? Deliverology. That was his baby. Yeah. So that, this was this whole idea of benchmarking and target setting, that the state should regulate outcomes and not outputs and not inputs. So Sir Michael Barber is a good example how ideas travel, because people travel. actors travel or because institutions connect different institutions. I think it's a very interesting piece of research and social net. We did it a little bit in the Norwegian project, in the Great Finnet project that Kirsten Sivisind was the PI. We did some social network analysis. But let me move on. So this is, again, just quickly as a recap, this is, and remember I said I like policy borrowing better than diffusion and transfer and mobilities, even though the other terms took over, because I really believe in the agency aspect, that it is an active act of borrowing, because it's not that there are not good ideas floating around, but the part of the reason why things are borrowed is because it gives a legitimacy to implement policy. And for policy, in policy studies, getting additional source of authorization helps, because any policy decision is highly political, and it helps for coalition building to be able to reference a global reform or traveling reform, even if the similar reform already exists in the country. But phrasing it as if it would be a global reform gives and what I call a quasi-external stamp of authorization. But it is really internally induced. It just comes across as something that is from outside. And then again, how it's translated is a big difference. So for instance, the rampant privatization that you see never happened in many Western European countries. It didn't happen except in Sweden. It did not happen in Nordic countries. So every reform, and including SAWA, is because of this, historical antecedents, or because of institutional legacies translated differently in each country. So the big difference between this meso-level analysis or institutional level analysis, which it tends to be qualitative, is we look from below, whereas the macro level, they look from a distance how ideas spread. And, it used to be that they would always try to separate from each other for the longest time, Shriver and the Stanford group, but actually they complement each other. One is macro level and one is just meso level, and both complement each other very nicely. So these are the three contextual lenses that I mentioned briefly. The topographical one, which is, I think, a very exciting new phenomenon that colleagues are interested in, the topographical aspect of policy borrowing or policy transfer. I focus on the three temporalities and the systems context. And specifically, the example I want to show you is at the intersection of sequence. Remember, we talked about the sequence, that it was access first and quality afterwards. And now I would like to add the institutional context. And we sometimes forget that education is part of public administration when we talk about policy. And we are part of public administration reform. So it is important to see what are the bigger reforms that happen, not in our sector, but especially in the Ministry of Finance, I would say, because public administration reform is always led by ministries of finance. So, Michelle, how are we doing on time? Because I can't see the, I have to hurry up.
A little bit.
Okay.
If you
So let me hurry
unfortunately.
Okay. So when you look at things, and that's what I'm trying to sell to you, to look at things in a sequence, then when you look back, and the Stanford Toronto group, they looked at the period, and they call it the neoliberal period. It's the period of autonomy and quality. Do you see this? This is the two middle rows. And if the role of the state changes every time, the autonomy stage, the role of the state was entrepreneurial, like stay away, let the markets do. And in fact, like Milton Friedman didn't even have tests. The whole idea of standardized tests came later. His idea was, if you give choice and you create this mechanism where schools have to compete over money, publicly funded schools, that they will do better. It's like the airline model. If you break the state monopoly, and like my generation, we knew that every country had one airline, sometimes two. Like the US had several, but most countries only had one airline. Once you break that monopoly and you allow the cheap providers to come in, the private sector, the price comes down of all the airlines. So this is what they predicted. And, actually it's true. It's true, but in a negative sense, with all the negative implications that it had. The entrepreneurial state it was all about market accountability. And it was output oriented. So it wasn't enforcing quality. You just had to count the number of heads of students and then you were entitled to get money. And again, when you look at things in a sequence, you understand that every reform that comes justifies itself by looking down on the previous reform, by scandalizing the previous reform because it needs to justify why it is important to have the reform. So when the entrepreneurial state came in, and this was public administration reform, it emphasized the high public expenditures that the welfare state had, that it could not hold up with the high expenditures that it had, because it was a redistributive state that gave money, took money from some and gave it to others. And it was a huge state apparatus coordinating that effort. Now, when we talk about the entrepreneurial state, there was something else I wanted to say that now does not come to my mind. But yeah, maybe it comes afterwards. So as part of the critique was that it was not sustainable, it was too expensive. So for instance, in Europe, at that time, Blair and Schroeder got together during the entrepreneurial. They took over around the millennium, and Clinton at the end in 97. So Clinton, Blair, and Schroeder, they were the three statesmen that said, it's too late now I know. So this is the example of Iceland. I was during my sabbatical in Iceland. And there it was very interesting. There we found one document, or my colleagues found, Berglind, Magnusdóttir, and Kolfinna Johannesdóttir, they found document from the Ministry of Finance instructing the 5 different line ministries, including Ministry of Education, to calculate what the cost of pedagogical services are. What are the cost of pedagogical service? Now, for God's sake, why would you want to know that? And why? Because new public management, and this is the era of autonomy, went along with new procurement laws. And as part of the new procurement laws, the state had to open every service, every procurement for goods and services to the private sector. It's not a closed system, the education system, but it is open to provision by non-state actors or by the private sector, you need to do contractual arrangements. You need to have contracting. Remember how we say in policy studies, there are like 5 ways of govern. One is contracts, one is law, one is incentives, one is information, like during COVID, and one is performance evaluation. That came later. That only came under quality. But contracting was the one tool of government that really was almost invented or boosted in this area of the entrepreneurial state, because it was all about not only allowing, but encouraging the private sector to come in and provide goods and services. And once this happened, you had to have the school, like in Iceland was a pilot school. They produced so many pages on how can you know that it was delivered. So they had to write down all the outputs that were expected. We would call it the scope of work. And why do you have this? Only because it was about new public procurement laws that went into effect in the mid-1990s. So every single OECD country had to report to the OECD whether they, progress. It's like countries now have to report on SDG 4. They had to report on progress with regard to the new procurement law and the new public management. Oops. Sorry. Let me just finish. Sorry. So this is the entrepreneur state. Then again, there were so many, as I said, it was rampant. It had all these negative implications, especially on quality and equity. That's when, again, the new reform criticized NPM actually for this inequity, unequal quality that came. That's the second column that you say. And the solution was SAWA. Leave the private sector there, encourage public-private partnership. That was the era that moved towards public-private partnership, and bring in accountability and bring in standardized curriculum as a condition to then develop standardized tests. So the type of regulation moved from outputs to outcomes. And outcomes, mind you, in the beginning, I remember it was not just test, it was also external evaluation, internal evaluation. It was a zillion things. But at the end, the only thing now that really, the other things still exist, and this is what all the schools complain, because it's a lot of paperwork that nobody looks at. But the one thing that really is consequential, as the Barcelona group would say, is tests. And the tests, so PISA or OECD, it's not coincidence that they came at the right time. They were driving the reform. So it was all about standards, accountability, and outcomes orientation. And why was that important? It meant that anyone can offer education. Anyone can open schools. And actually, at Teachers College, 1/3 of our programs are teacher education programs. Anyone can hire teachers, regardless if they're qualified or not, as long as students learn. And this was a way to regulate without kicking out the private sector or actually with encouraging public-private partnerships. So the interventionist state is one that believes in accountability, etc. So now this is the new era that it's not many talk about, but this is this is all my new book actually that will come out in the first quarter next year. And so the new era is actually the OECD and World Bank. They talk about e-government. Everyone poo-poos on new public management. Everyone poo-poos on neoliberal reforms. And why? Because they reduce the citizen to consumers, passive consumers. But in the era of social media, of technology, the consumer, the citizen, talks back all the time, talks back. Plus, the government sits on tons of data. So there is so much pressure on the state to release data and to allow. So now the whole talk about the engaged state, engaging citizen, participatory budgeting, sharing data. So data has had, taken on a completely new meaning, to the point where there's more and more data collected, but on different things. Like the OECD talks about the economy of well-being now. So moving beyond the GDP measures, education as a human capital, and they talk about social capital, they talk about environmental capital, and about another one. I forgot the fourth one. But you can look it up. So I think I have to finish up. So again, remember, sequence is really important. Then once you have this, you can break that down. And because we compare, you can look in comparative ed, we usually compare either over time, over space, or against global standards or international standards. This type of comparison that I'm interested in currently is doing case studies and comparing this global script. And this shows you very beautifully when you compare, like this is in two cantons of Zurich and of Switzerland, Zurich and St. Gallen, breaking down these two bundles of policies, and you can compare, was it approved, which is A, was it partially approved, was it rejected, and was it sustained? Like, was it even kept after a while? And you can do that with any country, you can do that with any district, with any province. And then once you have this, you can ask yourselves, why? And that's where the local policy context came in. Why was, for instance, professionalization of school management was approved and adopted in both countries, but incentives for non-state actors was rejected in both places. But for example, the last ones, performance-based pay for teachers, was adopted in Zurich, but approved in St. Gallen, but then was suspended. Sorry, S is suspended. You can look at again institutional legacies, and that's where historical institutionalist is important. Theory is important. You can see what happened in the local context, that some global reforms resonate and others do not resonate, and how are they translated. And then the last temporality, that's the duration. You can even go down for each one of them. So this is the example of professionalization of school management. We could see in Zurich there was a pilot phase, then there was a law, and then it was sustained. It's kept to this day. However, performance-based pay, very controversial, unpopular, because teachers hate each other, end up hating each other at the school level. Zurich was a pilot, St. Gallen, they both had it at law. St. Gallen dropped it completely in 2013, and Zurich kept it but didn't really enforce it. So I should end here so we have a little bit time for discussion. Sorry for going over time, and I'm gonna stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Gita. That was such a rich presentation. I felt like you could have drilled down into any one of those points for another half hour. So that was wonderful. I just wanted, before we move to our respondent, Rona Brown put an interesting comment in the chat that I think would interest you. Apparently, SAWA means similar in Kiswahili.
Similar.
Similar, yes.
Similar.
Now that's a gift. If nobody on the team knew that, that's quite an incredible coincidence.
Yeah.
Rona, by the way,
I know the piece she wrote with you on space.
Exactly.
No? On
And
Macy.
That's exactly right. In fact, she introduced me to Massey just to put the record straight. So yeah, so thank you so much for that. And we'll turn now to Tor Sorensen, who will offer a few comments. I think it would make sense, depending on how many questions we get, to go a few minutes after the hour, if people are okay with that. If you have to go, obviously, we'll understand. But I think we should maybe, due to the richness of your presentation, give it a few extra minutes if you can spare them. So Tor, over to you. Tor, are you able to unmute? Or Ian, are you able to help unmute Tor?
Now, I think. Yeah, you hear me?
Yeah,
okay,
yes,
great, thanks, great. Thank you so much, Gita, and thank you also for the invitation to be a respondent here. And yeah, wonderful to have the opportunity to engage with your work again, Gita, and it was indeed a very rich presentation, and just a few thoughts considering what you just presented. I noticed that you have published in Journal of Education Policy, and also there are some articles coming out in Nordic Journal of Studies in Educational Policy, all about SAWA, this global model, you could say, of school governance. I really appreciate that you take on this theoretical task, and it involves a lot of complexity, but trying to think more profoundly about what does all these policy bundle, as I think you have mentioned it, or you have phrased it, how that's manifests itself in different contexts. So this theoretical work, I think, is really, really important. And I think that you also, and that came clearly through today, you seek to consider both the historical institutionalism with this focus on trajectories, path dependency, but also a sense of agency, not least among governments, in how they relate to this policy bundle of SAWA and probably also other types of reforms. There's a lot of questions I could ask. But anyway, I'll try to stick to just to mention two that I would love to hear your thoughts on, and hopefully others here in the webinar will be able to relate to them as well in one way or the other. As I mentioned, I really appreciate that you stress the agency of governments, of policymakers in making decisions, a certain scope of autonomy. But also I'm curious to hear how that, if you see that there's some different patterns in how that looks in different places of the world, and also if international actors like the OECD, a lot of people have written about SAWA and the OECD, the World Bank, or maybe you or UNESCO, depending on where we are in the world, if we are in Tanzania or if we are in Northwestern Europe, are there different roles of actors in promoting the SAWA model, and let's say different capacities or different levels, different degrees of agency of national governments in translating this SAWA model? Because in some of your work, you have written about bilateral relations and focusing on that. And in other parts of your work, you have also focused on the role of let's say, global actors, international actors like the OECD and the World Bank. So I'm really curious to hear if these big international actors like OECD, World Bank, UNESCO, if they have different roles in the diffusion of the model, depending on where in the world, which context we are looking at. And perhaps the different levels of agency among national governments, depending on the context. I would love to hear your take on that. Another question, which is more short, is you mentioned public administration reforms. And do you think that there are any insights that we can gain from looking at other sectors, policy sectors like health policy? And would there be any lessons, any insights we could gain from comparing education reform with, for example, health policy reform? Mm-hmm. So these were my two questions. Thank you so much again, Gita. It was super interesting. I look forward to dig into your book next year. Thank you so much.
Michelle, shall I answer now or? Okay. So these are all, it's great to see you, Tore Sorensen. I love your work too. So it's great to see you and have you as a discussant. Both two great questions. The first is the role of international organizations. There is this early work in diffusion of innovation, but specifically in when it comes to diffusion and policy transfer, the early work of Frank Dobbins, who's at Harvard now, and Lee and Strang, they say that global actors legitimize reform. That's their role. And by legitimizing some reforms over others, they help with the dissemination. So what I added to what's out there already, for instance, the downsizing of public administration, that was one of the things that Lee and Strang looked into. The downsizing, it helps to have lead countries like the US first downsize. This was the post-welfare stage, right? During the entrepreneurial stage. They follow the leader, like phenomenon. But once international organizations, such with OECD, concretely, it was the PUMA committee in 1993, where country after country, OECD country, had to report whether they have reduced their debt, because it was the era of preparation towards the euro. And there was an agreement within OECD countries that they would reduce the state deficit and the debt. And they had to report to this PUMA committee, it's called, at OECD. So they legitimized the downsizing and the outsourcing and the new public procurement laws that was so much part of NPM, which we don't talk enough about because it was a public administration reform that we just were part of it, but it was a Ministry of Finance reform. But it was handed over, and we had the same downsizing effect in all line ministries, including in education. So what I added to this idea that international organizations legitimize, or I say they put the international stamp of approval on one national reform, and then it goes berserk, it spreads like wildfire. What they also do is they accelerate or slow down reforms, depending on whether it fits their own portfolio. So if it fits their own portfolio, and remember, for both OECD and the World Bank, the counterparts are ministries of finance. They couldn't care less about line ministries. It's the Ministry of Finance that are the clients. So that's why public administration reform is so important to study. And they helped accelerate that by having all kinds of tools of governance. And PISA is what PUMA is for Ministry of Finance. PISA is a way of reporting in the education sector. It's reporting back how we are doing in terms of improving the quality of education. So let's just look at PISA as a reforming tool from countries to OECD. That's what it is. It's not more and it's not less. It's similar to Ministry of Finance filling out templates regarding how they downside, etc. Now, we have the big five in education. We have Global Partnership for Education, World Bank, OECD, UNICEF, and UNESCO. Plus, we have, of course, Gates Foundation and LEGO and Porticus and what have you. But from those five multilaterals, the only ones, UNESCO is important for convening, and I love UNESCO. I'm UNESCO chair. They convene, they have a human rights approach. But really, for global dissemination, the only two that really matter are OECD and World Bank. And they have exactly the same agenda. They just have a division of labor in terms of which countries are their clients. And they have a public administration reform agenda. And that's really important to understand. They are not evil people. They are not evil institutions. They are all about budgets, about management. So of course their reforms are managerial, like Robertson. And, and Tony, they talk about managerial reforms. Of course, they are managerial. Of course. Why are we so surprised? They are OECD and World Bank reforms. So they have a division of labor there between the two. And the reforms, because they were, for instance, they both have at around the same time they talk about in the education sector, school autonomy and accountability. The only difference is the World Bank paper says school autonomy, they call it school-based management, the World Bank, and they don't call it autonomy. They call it school-based management and they call it accountability, both organizations, and they sometimes add assessment as part of their package. But it's the same package, just different countries. Now, what can we learn from health? And here I have a disagreement with a little bit of NORAC, who I love. I don't think we should be comparing with the health sector. I really don't think. And everyone loves to compare with the health sector. We have a democratization of expertise in education. The education sector is much more politicized than any other sector that exists. Any other line minister, everyone in the education sector has an opinion on what good education is. Everyone, just by sheer fact of growing up. and having been a child and having been a mother and having been a grandmother, etc. So it is a different kind of expertise, and it shows also in the language. I mean, this expert knowledge, expert, like the terminology, it's a terminology of exclusion in the health sector. And we have a terminology of inclusion. Everyone knows what we talk about education. People even laugh when they think, oh, education is an expertise. Yes, it is. But in health, nobody would laugh. If a health specialist, everyone says, oh, yeah, it's really necessary to have health specialists. So, no, I think it's not comparable, actually.
Thanks for that, Gita. Really interesting. Yes, and reforms are not vaccines. Right. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, but we've gone a little bit over the hour, but most people are still on the webinar. If you need to go, thank you for coming, but I'm going to suggest that if there are 2 or 3 questions to collect that we can give to you all at once to just hear a little bit more from you, we can do that. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A or the chat, or raise your hand, and I'll ask my colleagues to help me spot anyone who would like to ask something or make a comment. Okay. Well, I think everyone's got a lot to take in, Gita. I'm sitting on multiple questions, but I'm going to let them go, and I will ask you them another time, because I have found this so fascinating.
Okay.
Is there anyone? No? Okay. Thank you so much again. Very, very grateful for your time, your expertise, your insights, and thank you so much again for coming and joining us and contributing to our webinar series. And thank you everyone for coming. And in whatever way you can, please give a round of applause to Gita for her presentation today.
Thank you so much.
Our next webinar is going to be with Professor Kwame Achimpong on December the 10th. So I hope that everyone on the call will be able to join us then. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.